Hi, this is Paul, and I want to play a little clip for you. So often when we listen to Peterson, there's so much going on. There's a lot of little things we don't hear. But I'm just going to isolate this, and you might have missed it if you listen to the Jordan Peterson Bishop Barron conversation.
Or that there is a structure that encounters possibility. That's built into reality itself.
Mm-hmm.
And that structure is God the Father.
Did you hear that? That structure is God the Father. Listen to it again.
Or that there is a structure that encounters possibility. That's built into reality itself.
Mm-hmm.
And that structure is God the Father.
That's something analogous to the God number one I use to describe Jordan Peterson when he talks about God. So often, when I've been listening to a number of the Peterson recordings lately, he'll have a section on consciousness. And it's an important section, but it's usually not the part of the talk that gets all the attention. It'll be whether he believes in God or all of that. But in each of these talks, he goes into a section on consciousness. And I'm going to return to the first in the biblical series in this video. And I've been thinking lately how I should go back to that series and listen to that again and really try to get my mind around what he's talking about. Because now, after listening to him for a couple of years now, I've got a much better idea, I think, of what's going on with Peterson, what he means by his words, what he's really trying to say. A lot of this has been growing out of my appreciation of really a lot of what he says in terms of consciousness and our learning. The more attention I pay to my own consciousness, the more I realize what a bad learner and listener I am. How much simply gets by me? Well, why don't I know what gets by me? It's because this gets into some of the Vervaeke stuff, because my salience sensors are grabbing onto this stream as it rushes past me, and in a sense the things that I'm picking out, the things that I'm interested in, are those things that I'm actually seeing and knowing, but so much more goes by me. So what I often do if there's a podcast or a video is that my salient sensors say is very important, and my consciousness Congress says, well, pay some attention to that. I'll listen to it a number of times, and when I go through it a number of times, I begin to realize that, there's a lot more going on there than I thought, and I missed so much my first time through. Maybe the second time I'll learn more. So again, just listen to this little, I have to put myself in the little box to play it. Listen to this, and then I'll play the larger quote.
Or that there is a structure that encounters possibility. That's built into reality itself.
Mm-hmm.
And that structure is God the Father.
So obviously, possibility, potential, chaos, all of this huge world out there, there's a structure that encounters possibility, and that structure is consciousness, all right? And in terms of ourselves, consciousness is the structure that encounters possibility out there in the world, and it's in this conscious space that we engage with this possibility, and we turn this possibility into habitable order. And if I say it that way, and when we go back to the biblical series, you'll see that this then is a mirror image of what we see in Genesis. And again, it's astounding to me. How much of this did I see this the first time through? I hadn't done any of that thinking with respect to consciousness. I hadn't done any of the thinking or talking that I've done in the last year and a half, mostly on a lot of these videos. So let's play the much larger segment and hear what he has to say.
Well, and I've been talking to my audiences practically about certain elements of, let's say, Judeo-Christian fundamental beliefs. So, and I spent, I think, 2.5 hours, the first biblical lecture I did on the first sentence of Genesis, and then tried to take the opening chapters apart in great detail. But some very interesting propositions from a psychological and philosophical perspective in Genesis. I mean, I look at it sort of technically, in some sense, as a statement about the nature of being. I mean, what Genesis reveals, or that there is a structure that encounters. There has to be a structure to encounter. That's built into reality. or that there is a structure that encounters being. I mean, what Genesis reveals.
I can't pause with the space bar here. But again, pay attention when he's talking about being. This is for Peterson, this big word about everything that's out there. The perception is that, okay, so if we have to bring everything, if we have to bring life and existence that we encounter individually, personally, now there's a lot of phenomenology behind this. Being, capital B, using Heidegger's words. This is, in a sense, the context in which this consciousness cloud, this consciousness forum that's in a sense before us, this is where it all plays out. Let's see if I go back from where I stopped in there. Yeah, it does good.
Feels to me is that there has to be a structure to encounter possibility, or that there is a structure that encounters possibility. That's built into reality itself. And that structure is God the Father. And that structure uses a process. And the process is the logos. And the logos is something like courageous, truthful.
So right away there you have God the Father. God the Father is the structure that processes chaos. Now, if you've listened to the biblical series, you can already see Genesis 1 unfolding and his interpretation of Genesis 1 unfolding. So God the Father encounters chaos, and God the Father, in fact, has and potentially is consciousness. That structure is God the Father. Those are the words he used. That structure is God the Father, and then God the Father uses the Logos. Now, this gets into some really deep Trinitarian ideas very quickly that I'm not going to get into, but that God the Father uses the Logos to create, obviously, he's appropriating John 1 in this, to appropriate habitable order. So he takes John 1 and he puts it back into Genesis 1, and this is what's coming out.
Communication. It's the word, but it's much more than that. And it uses that to encounter this potential and to generate order. And it seems to me that that's psychologically akin to what human beings do with their own consciousness. Well, and I've been talking to my audiences practically generate order. And it seems to me that that's psychologically akin to what human beings do with their own consciousness.
And I've mentioned before the illustration of, I used it in my Sunday school class, actually. That's where I thought of the illustration, because if you watch my Sunday school classes on the other channel and you're watching this channel, you'll hear that all this stuff is going through my same head, and I'm in the Gospel of John in that class. But I made the illustration that if we're sitting in the Sunday school, if everyone came into that Sunday school class in the morning and there was a cat in the room, that cat would basically introduce a degree of chaos into the room, and people would come into the class and they'd be asking about the cat and wondering about the cat. And if I would say, oh, that's my cat, the cat is here for such and such a reason, suddenly that word would turn the chaos into order for all the other conscious beings in the room. Okay, that's a nice tiny little handy illustration about how Logos turns chaos into order. But that's obviously all psychological in that illustration. Now, if you take that and you take John 1 and Genesis 1 and you put them together in this Jordan Peterson-esque way, the consciousness of God the Father, that structure is God the Father. That consciousness is moving matter. Now we're getting into something more, formal cause of Aristotle. That consciousness is moving matter, and matter is obeying the structure and the Logos in the way that my mental pictures are obeying the words that I'm using, or the way that the people's implicit sense of order is obeying the Logos of me explaining the cat in the classroom. Okay? Now, when you think about it that way, it's very powerful. And when you think about it that way and you look at the stories of Jesus and the kinds of things he did kinds of miracles he did in the New Testament, like walking on water or stilling a storm, it fits. Okay? It fits. Let's go back here.
The new atheist types and the materialist scientists tend to consider human beings deterministic organisms. But my understanding of neuropsychology is that the only time that we are deterministic organisms is when circuits for specific tasks have been built up through lengthy practice and can be run automatically. Yeah. And much of the time in our lives, and I talk to my audiences about this, what we do is we wake up in the morning, our consciousness reappears on the plane of being, let's say, and what we face in front of us is an unstructured and potential-filled chaos. Yeah. And our consciousness determines the manner in which that potential transforms itself into the actuality of order, into the present and the past. And
now that's really key, because when we wake up, I mean, and I love the illustration, you wake up and now your consciousness is in the midst of the chaos and you bring order to that chaos. You don't just bring order to that chaos in terms of word, explaining literally words, but you bring order to that chaos in a whole variety of ways. And in that sense, we're sort of sub-creators, not anywhere near the power of the original creator, because in fact the entire materiality belongs to him. But we as small creators, in a sense, participate in that same consciousness and bring that order then into the room. All right? That's what he's saying.
And I think everyone understands that. We treat each other that way. Like we treat ourselves as if we are responsible for what we bring into existence. That's part of our moral responsibility. We treat each other as if that's part of what makes us worthwhile as creatures, right? Yeah. That's part of our value. We treat ourselves.
This is all getting into agency and how we regard each other as agents and how we regard each other as real moral agents. We hold people accountable to the degree that they bring order or chaos into the shared realm that we all inhabit.
As if the nature of what we bring into being is determined by our choices between good and evil. And we treat other people the same way. Like you can't have a friendship with someone if you don't believe that they have that power of choice and that capacity for morality. You don't have any respect for them, and they won't interact with you. And so you can't found a friendship on that, and you can't found a family.
Now it's interesting here that obviously in his story there are multiple characters. Now with a friendship or a family or a spouse. What's interesting, obviously, in terms of Christian theology and the Trinity is that you have that structure within the Godhead in Christianity. That structure is God the Father. That's the first thing he says out of his mouth, but very quickly that structure begins to grow, and this consciousness isn't just the consciousness of one, but it's the consciousness of three who are collaborating, who are unified in mission, but who are yet collaborating between each other, and it's between the different. Boy, this stuff gets complicated. Between the different, maybe I'll have to ask Nathan Jacobs about whether these, because if you listen to the Hank Hanegraaff podcast, he doesn't like the word persons because persons is Latin. How these different, if and I think this is biblical, how our different consciousnesses collaborate and participate within each other to achieve shared goals. And the Trinity does this too.
And you can't found a society without the fundamental presupposition that individuals, and this is another element, of course, of the presuppositions in Genesis, that that the individual is somehow made in the image of God. If God is that which confronts potential and generates order, and more, because God says too in Genesis that
Now, this made in the image of God is a big thing, because I could pull commentaries up off my shelf. Genesis is up there. I can pull commentaries off my shelf with all of the various debates on what Genesis 1 means by we're made in his image, male and female. Okay, God is not male. God is not female. But male and female are both come out of God's. Both are male and female are both made in God's image, and there's something about the union that obviously male and female together procreate. So there's a ton in this tiny little thing, and it is amazing that this comes out of. And we'll get to this later in the video. This comes out of a guy who says, "Well, I don't dare say I believe in God," who just said that structure is God the Father. So, okay, But all of this, actually what he's doing, if you kind of slow these words down, and if you begin to understand what he means by these things, there's a ton packed in it. And again, I'm convinced that we listen to it, and our little conscious self, so much just blows past us. But the rest of us, our consciousness congress is maybe sort of like a filter, sort of like, how clams, when I was in Australia, went and saw the Great Barrier Reef, and you have these clams that are just on these giant clams that are on the bottom of the seafloor, and all they're doing all the time is filtering. You have whales with these, huge mouths, and they open up not to swallow little wooden puppets, but they're filtering the all these microorganisms out of the ocean, and all of those are what go feeding the whale. And perhaps that's an image of how we're working, our tiny little consciousness. Tons of stuff is flowing by us, and actually our mind is picking up on all of these things and filtering it. And every now and then our salience detector says, "Look over there." And we go, "Well, why? I didn't see anything." Look over there again. And you get the sense of, well, how do we know things that we don't know? And how do we learn things that never pass through our consciousness filter? And why is it that when you grow up and you have a child, that the first draft of you as a parent was written by your parents, even though as a child you didn't sit there and ponder consciously or articulate the structure of your parents? But all of this stuff we know, but our conscious selves don't know it. Okay? And all of this is going on.
Every time he constructs something that's new and orderly, using the logos, he says, "And it was good." Mm-hmm. And that's so fascinating to me, because it's repeated so many times, because what it implies is that if the potential of being is confronted with what's good and truthful and courageous, then what emerges as a consequence is good. And I also believe that to
and that's classic articulation of what I'd call Peterson's gospel, that use consciousness, and it's courageous because, well, it's and this again is built into the Christ story. So he courageously encounters with good all of the chaos and frankly evil that's out there. And in the Christ story, we like in our American movies, we like to imagine that the good guy triumphs. Well, in the Christ story, which is very realistic to most of human history, the good guy gets killed. And then you think, and everybody around there looked at that and said, well, how do you call that winning? I like my Christs uncrucified. I like my heroes appearing triumphant. I like them to look strong, standing over the bloodied corpse of their enemy. But Peterson, that's a rather dramatic statement of faith that he makes in this articulation of the good.
Be the case for individuals. If you confront the world in a manner that's Cain-like, bitter, incapable of making the proper sacrifices, enraged, jealous, outraged at the suffering of existence and its essential unfairness, then you become vengeful and bitter and murderous and genocidal. And That seems like no positive way forward.
That's no bargain. Yeah.
With the new atheist types, they demolish the metaphysics without really thinking it through, I think, and they leave people with nothing. And the nothing is so empty that it just really produces pain for people. Like, I've talked to many, many, many people, including atheists, who have been vastly relieved to find some deeper meaning in the archaic stories that our culture is predicated
on. Every day I deal with that is people that they feel obligated intellectually to accept the new atheist, conclusions, but then their whole soul is rebelling against it. And I would say for obvious reasons.
Now, obviously listen to the whole podcast, but again, part of my point in this, and really what I do in my videos, is when we listen to the whole podcast, we sit down and it's about an hour and a half long and we listen to the whole thing and so much is coming at us. Now maybe our filters are picking up on some things, but consciously, part of the real limitation of our consciousness is that we live in the moment, that we hear something and it strikes a chord. Now if you listen to the monologue video just before this one where I'm dealing with Owen Barfield, it's like the wire passing over the magnets, that there's a spark and that spark happens and we gain an insight. But very quickly, memory might record some of those insights, or it might go on and record them in paper, or I might record them in video, but they're sort of lost. And so consciousness is in a sense, now again, all of our metaphors are based on the technology that we have. I mean, consciousness is sort of like RAM as opposed to the hard drive in a computer, that the RAM is this momentary memory that things are always swapping in and out of. And so our autobiographical self is obviously memory is used that, but obviously our memory is very selective, because in autobiography, if we're asked to explain ourselves in one sentence, it's nothing, and we I gotta grab my water bottle, get a drink of water. So we basically need hierarchies to filter all of this stuff. And so salience, and again, Vervaeke's been working on the salience stuff. Salience is what pushes things up to the top of the consciousness hierarchy. I've used the illustration before. If I were to open the door to my office, my eyes tend to go on whatever it is that I'm thinking about or looking for when I come into the office. And we look for opportunities and we look for obstacles. We look for opportunities and we look for threats. If I were to open the door of my office and there's a cat in my office, well, suddenly I'd be in a little bit of chaos, depending on the size of the cat. If it's a 200-pound cat, I would be in a lot of chaos, and my reaction would be different than if it was a 6-pound cat, let's say. So this is how we're working, and this stuff is happening all the time, and we're, for the most part, completely unconscious of it. And here I am, 55 years old, and living all my life, and here at this late age, I'm actually feeling like I'm learning some things about how life works, but I felt like that for pretty much all of my life, which leads me to believe that if this is true of my tiny little 55-year-old life, how much more is there out there that I'm not even close to learning? Now, again, this is where I get into my Calvinism, because I believed we are saved by God, not saved by ourselves, because if I'm my own savior, I'm in real trouble, because I don't even know what it's like to be a human being. I know what it's like in some ways, but if you ask me to explain it, we're only scratching the surface. Now, I want to go back to the biblical series, and for a while I've been thinking I should really go back to that whole thing and do more commentaries on it, partly because I know so much, I feel like I know so much more about Peterson than I did at first. When I did at first, it was all unexplored territory, and how did he use his terms, and what did he mean by these terms? And now when I go back to listen to videos that I listened to a year or more ago, or almost 2 years ago, some of these videos have been out, I realize how much I didn't know, or maybe how much I don't remember knowing. I mean, this is how small we are. So So I want to go back and I want to listen to what he's talking about in terms of what is God. And so here in the first video, he says, that structure is God the Father. This is for a guy who doesn't dare say he believes in God. That structure is God the Father. Well, let's listen to what this structure is. Dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum. You can do it. You can do it, Google. There you go.
Okay. So this is the idea, essentially, that you have the unknown world. That's just what you don't know at all. That's the outside. That's the ocean that surrounds the island that you inhabit.
The ocean that surrounds the island you inhabit, that island is consciousness. And so this huge ocean of unknown territory is constantly surrounded by all of us.
Something like that. It's chaos itself. And then you act in that world, and you act in ways you don't understand. There's more to your actions than you can understand.
And now, again, if you go back to his Roger Scruton videos, it's when you encounter things you don't expect. It's when you make mistakes. It's when something bumps against you, that thing is real. And like he says, you don't actually know why you act. And part of this is, again, because once I've started all of this, I began to pay much more careful attention to things like, well, why is my hand reaching out to open that cupboard? Actually, I'm a pretty absent-minded person. And so things in the kitchen haven't always changed places that often. But how often will I notice myself to open a cupboard that I consciously know the plates have been moved from this cupboard to this cupboard, yet I open the old cupboard? Well, how does my body know where the plates are when, if you'd ask me consciously to pause and think about it, say, no, the plates are over there? What really is the relationship between my body and my conscious mind, and who or what is doing the driving? These are very real questions. We used to actually tease my father quite a bit because he'd go into the kitchen, he'd not know where anything was. And actually, if you'd force him to sit down and tell you consciously, you could probably do it. But this is how disengaged our minds and our bodies are from each other.
One of the things Jung said, I loved this when I first understood it. He said, everybody acts out a myth, but very few people know what their myth is.
That's a really profound thing. And I probably didn't understand the profundity of it when I first heard this video. But listen to that again. We're acting out these stories, and we don't even know what these stories are. These stories are inhabiting us.
And he said, actions than you can understand. One of the things Jung said, I loved this when I first understood it. He said, everybody acts out a myth, but very few people know what their myth is. And you should know what your myth is because it might be a tragedy, and maybe you don't want it to be. And
now we get into, well, who doesn't want it to be? Who is the wanter in this mysterious confabulation that I am? And does that wanter actually want good things?
It's really worth thinking about because you have a pattern of behavior that characterizes you, and God only knows where you got it. Partly it's biological, partly it's from your parents, it's your unconscious assumptions, it's the way the philosophy of your society has shaped you, and it's aiming you somewhere. Well, is it aiming you somewhere you want to go? That's a good question.
Again, somewhere you want to go? How do I know where I want to go?
That's part of self-realization, We know we don't understand our actions. That's almost every argument you have with someone is about that. It's like, well, why did you do that? And you come up with some half-baked reasons why you did it.
I have this with my wife all the time. She'll say, why did you do that? And I think, I used to just, the rider on the elephant would just blurt out a reason. Now it's like, I just say, well, I don't know why I did that. It doesn't make her any happier when I give her that answer. But it's the more truthful answer. I don't know why I did that. Well, you want me to sit down and think about it? Well, the writer will give you an answer, but why? It's a really good question.
You're flailing around in the darkness. You try to give an account for yourself, but you can only do it partially. It's very, very difficult because you're a complicated animal with the beginnings of an articulated mind, something like that. And you're just way more than you can handle. And
that's right. You are way more than you can handle. And as a pastor, conversations I have with people are all about that. Pastor, why? Goes all the way back to Romans 7. Why do I do the things that I don't want to do, or at least I say I don't want to do, or at least I say I don't want to do religiously in church? And why don't I do the things that I say I want to do? I say I want to eat right and lose weight and tithe and be in church every week and be a better father and be a better husband and all of those things. Why don't I do those things? You have no idea. Because the confabulation that you are is a mystery to you and everyone else around you.
All right, so you act things out, right? You act things out. And that's a kind of competence. And then you imagine what you act out.
And it's a kind of competence if you're actually acting out things relatively successful in the world.
You imagine what everyone else acts out. And so there's a tremendous amount of information in your action. And then that information is translated up into the dream and into art, into mythology and literature. And
okay, let's slow that down and back that up.
There's a tremendous information is translated up into the dream in your action. And then that information is
phone call, I'm dealing with plumbing stuff.
Translated up into the dream and into art. And you imagine what everyone else acts out. And so there's a tremendous amount of information in your action.
That's really critical too. There's a tremendous amount of information in your action, and you have to look at that fairly literally, in that just like there's way more information out there in the world, there's way more information in your action than you are consciously aware of.
And then that information is translated up into the dream and into art, into mythology.
Okay, now that information gets picked up by the rest of our filters, all right? And it gets picked up by our filters, and, well, again, what are we using consciousness for all day long? Well, we're using consciousness for all the things that we need to survive. And now that we're living in, rooms with walls that are in societies with police officers, and we have enough food in our bellies, in fact, more food in our bellies than we need, and we have all of this. Well, what are we using consciousness for? No, now we're using consciousness to pursue our desires and our dreams and our goals and our agendas and the things that we think we want and all of this stuff. So how on earth can the rest of our minds communicate within the consciousness Congress to this little tiny thing that is our consciousness? Well, it uses all of this space that consciousness doesn't like to seed or doesn't seed. So it comes up in our dreams. And, I've been talking to Karen Wong, and if you look at the conversation with her, she develops a huge amount of chaos, and then she looks for tiny pieces she looks for anomalies. That's how she got into Jordan Peterson. She looked for anomalies. You find anomalies in that chaos, and her art begins to grow from that anomaly. And you have it with basketball shooters. If you have a great 3-point shooter or a free throw shooter, and you ask them to explain what they're doing while they're shooting, they'll probably miss, unless they've really, really got it dialed into a very, a shooting stroke that is extremely. But this is how we are, and so all of this stuff gets grabbed by our minds, which is really incredible, and one way or another tries to get it into the consciousness. And so if you read Jung's autobiography, for example, it'll drive you crazy listening to all these dreams he has. And I was reading that. It's like, dude, I got to listen to a lot of other people because I'm a pastor. Do I really got to read through your dreams? Well, he's saying, well, there's important stuff. And then he and Freud sit down, and they're gonna try and interpret the dream. So what does it mean to interpret a dream? It means to try to take some of this chaos and turn it into habitable order. When I interpret the Bible, some of the chaos of the Bible. Now, I'm not saying that the Bible is chaos. I'm saying it's chaos to me, and I try and turn it into habitable order. What I'm really trying to do is domesticate it and incorporate it and integrate it into all of the orders and structures that I have, which is part of the reason why when people come to the Bible from different places, they're coming to the Bible from from an Islamic point of view, or from a Reformed point of view, or from a Baptist point of view, or a Roman Catholic point of view, or a modernist point of view, or a critical theory point of view, or a gender studies point of view, what you find is that they all get different things out of the Bible. Well, why? Because the process of interpretation is using it as a filter. And so what you actually do is you take things at the top of your value hierarchy and you filter the chaos through that, and now it's in a digestible manner that you can take in and process on your own. That's what we're doing, and actually this is what we're doing all the time. So you wake up in the morning, you had a troubled dream, and you sit there and maybe you tell your spouse about the troubled dream, say, or you tell your counselor or your pastor about the dream, and you're trying to fit it into habitable order, which again is the role of this consciousness that Peterson was talking to Bishop Barron about.
In literature, and there's a tremendous amount of information in that.
And the same thing you do with literature. When you go to English class and you try to interpret a poem or a story, you're trying to turn it into habitable order, and then you're probably recording it and you're trying to integrate it into your body. And so you can see very quickly that the stories out there and the story in here, we're constantly trying to make sense between these things. And actually, later in the video, I'll play an earlier part of this where he lays that out. And the problem is that if these stories are not fitting together, we are emotionally disturbed by it. We experience distress, and then suddenly we start changing big things in our lives. We start changing our religions, or changing our jobs, or changing our spouses, or changing our look, or changing our gender, and we're going to change everything to try and make these stories fit together. And here's the thing, a lot of what we are, and this is part of what's happening with this whole rapid onset gender dysphoria conversation, a whole lot of what we are is by the story that we are surrounded by watching others do things. Okay?
And then some of that is translated into articulated thought. And I'll give you a quick example of something like that. I think this is partly what happens in Exodus when Moses comes up with the law. You know, he's wandering around with the Israelites forever in the desert, and they're like going left and going right and worshiping idols and like having a hell of a time and, getting rebellious. And Moses goes up in the mountain and he has this tremendous revelation sort of in the sight of God.
And now this story is interesting, and by virtue of, how can I say this? By virtue of the communal representations by conflicting tribes, when he tells the story this way, he is tripping over all sorts of boundaries in a variety of tribes, okay? But that doesn't take away from what he's trying to illustrate. Now, beneath this, he's making an assertion about something, which is an assertion from a particular philosophical, historical position. But the thing that he's illustrating isn't really taken away from by all of the boundaries he's tripping on with this illustration.
It illuminates him, and he comes down with the law. You think, well, Moses acted as a judge. I know this is a mythological story. Moses acted as a judge in the desert, and he was continually mediating between people.
See, and what essentially he's doing, he's taking the story and turning it into there's the hint of here that it's merely psychological, and this is where we get into these questions of inner and outer meaning, like from the Owen Barfield video. This stuff gets really complicated really fast.
People who are having problems, constantly trying to keep peace. And so what are you doing when you're trying to keep peace? Is you're trying to understand what peace is, right? You have to apply the principles. Well, what are the principles? Well, you don't know. The principles are whatever satisfies people enough to make peace. And maybe you do that 10,000 times, and then you get some sense of, oh, here's the principles that bring peace. And then one day it blasts into your consciousness like a revelation. Here's the rules that we're already acting out. Well, that's the 10 Commandments. They're there to begin with. And Moses comes forward and says...
Now, one of the things I'd really love, and if he ever gets into Exodus, we get into this narrative of the development of the law from a psychological perspective, I'm probably going to bring in the beginning of C.S. Lewis's Problem of Pain, because C.S. Lewis makes a number of observations in the beginning of that book that really add quite a bit more mystery to this. Because what it shows is that we're seriously divided inside of ourselves. That gets expressed in Romans chapter 7. We're seriously divided inside of ourselves. We know this good, and we say we should do this good, yet we don't do that good.
Look, this is already basically what we're doing, but now it's codified, right? And like that.
And so what does that do? Now you have an external representation. Oh, well, why is that external representation? What power does the external representation give the codes that you already have acted out and communally are implicitly agreeing upon? What does that added step of representation actually accomplish psychologically in our midst? That's a really cool question.
That's all a historical process that's condensed into a single story, but obviously that happened because we have written law. Right? And that emerged in good legal systems. That emerges from the bottom up. That's English common law is exactly like that. Right? It's single decisions that are predicated on principles that are then articulated and made into the body of law. And the body of law is something you act out. That's why it's a body of law. If you're a good citizen.
Now it's a body of law, meaning in a sense that there's sort of a hierarchy to it. There's a cohesion to it. It's not just individual laws, but all of the laws work together and point towards something and deliver something that is more than just the sum of its parts.
You act out the body of law, and the body of law has principles. Okay, so the question is, there's principles that guide our behavior. What are those principles? Well, I think if you want the initial answer of what the archaic Israelites meant by God, that's something like what they meant. Now, it's not a good enough explanation, but...
See, again, this is one of these things that easily gets by us. But again, this is the guy that says he doesn't dare believe in God, but look at how much he uses the word, and look at how he uses it, and look at how foundational it is to him. He doesn't even know how he's using it, perhaps. I don't know.
Look, some answer of what the archaic Israelites meant by God, that's something like what they meant. Now, it's not a good enough explanation, but look, imagine that you're a chimpanzee and you have a powerful, dominant figure at the pinnacle of your society. That represents power. Now, more than that, because it's not sheer physical prowess that keeps a chimp at the top of the hierarchy. It's much more complicated than that. But you could say, well, there's a principle that the dominant person manifests. And then you might say, well, that principle shines forth even more brightly if you know 10 people who are dominant, powerful. Then you can extract out what dominance means from that. You can extract out what power means from that.
And you don't just extract it out. Now, when he says you extract it out, he's meaning that it's far more than that, because you don't even extract this thing out consciously, but it becomes a pattern in your mind that you recognize. And so when you see another chimp come up that has those qualities, well, not really a chimp, but let's say a man, you push him up the mating hierarchy, which is kind of a crazy thing. And you might even be willing to die for that man, because he's exhibiting excellencies. Ooh, I gotta get this. HVAC. It wasn't the HVAC man. It was a guy asking permission if he could take clips from my videos. So good luck. I don't know it'll gain you many views, but that's a great compliment. So I can't wait to see. I should have told him, send me an email when you start publishing it so I can see what you're doing. Hope he does. So anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, so you don't consciously say, ooh, I like that quality. That quality is important. You push somebody else up the hierarchy. Well, why? Well, at your own expense even, because somehow part of you knows that this is better for the community. Now, that's something. And we do that. Pretty crazy.
And then you can divorce the concept from the people. And we had to do that at some point because we can say power in a human context and we can imagine what that means, but it's divorced from any specific manifestation of power. Well, how the hell did we do that? Like, that's so complicated. If you're a chimp, the power is in another chimp. It's not some damn abstraction. Well, so the question is, think about it. We're in these hierarchies, many of them across centuries. We're trying to figure out what the guiding principle is. We're trying to extract out the core of the guiding principle. And we turn that into a representation of a pattern of being. Well, it's something like that. That's God. It's an abstracted ideal. And it's put in personified form.
And we're going to have to talk about that. Why do we put it into personified form? I would, well, just a little bit ahead of it, I would say we put it into personified form because implicitly we know that persons have power over the immaterial. And if it's simply an idea or an ideal, that's not sufficient for us.
It manifests itself in personified form, but that's okay because what we're trying to get at is in some sense, the essence of what it means to be a properly functioning and properly social and properly competent individual.
We're reaching for a star. We're looking to achieve something. The quality, the metaphysics of quality. We're upping the quality here. That's probably said it wrong.
Trying to figure out what that means. You need an embodiment. You need an ideal that's abstracted that you could act out that would enable you to understand what that means.
Now, one of the things he'll often talk about lately is this idea of noble. And I think what does that word noble mean? I mean, we use it all the time. We use it and we recognize, well, that's noble. Well, that's not noble. You don't want to be that. You do want to be that. And you get to Eric's conversation that's attractive. We find something admirable. And so we want to live up to that. And when you look at human beings, what human beings do, you look at a small child there, if their father is a noble person, you emulate that nobility. You try to act out that nobility. And the small child will do things like wear his father's shoes or put on his father's clothes or walk like his father, something like that, because somehow inside of us, even a 2 or 3-year-old has a sense of that which is noble. Now, diversity of cultures and things, there's a lot which gets imagined to be noble, which really isn't noble. And so what we're also doing is we're always perfecting and recalibrating and trying to fine-tune that which is noble and trying to articulate it. And we fight with each other about it. And we say, this is more noble than that. And it gets highly complex and quite distributed. But that's the process of what we're doing.
And that's what we've been driving at. So that's the first hypothesis in some sense. I'm going to go over some of the attributes of this abstracted ideal that we've formalized as God, but that's the first sort of hypothesis, is that a philosophical or moral ideal manifests itself first as a concrete pattern of behavior that's characteristic of a single individual. And then it's a set of individuals. And then it's an abstraction from that set. And then you have the abstraction. It's so important.
But you know, we use the word abstraction. Is it? That's a scary thought, because I think we're comfortable with abstraction, and abstraction is a legitimate word for it. But is it merely an abstraction? Because actually we're not comfortable with leaving it merely as an abstraction. We very quickly want to embody it, which is why people dress up like Luke Skywalker to go watch a movie.
So here's a political implication, for example. One of the debates, we might say, between early Christianity and the late Roman Empire was whether or not an emperor could be God, literally, right? To be deified, to be put in a temple. And you can see why that might happen, because that's someone at the pinnacle of a very steep hierarchy who has a tremendous amount of power and influence.
Now this actually, again, as we get into later, I'm reading a book on Erasmus and Luther, and this is not just a conversation with respect to civil authorities, because look how we differentiate civil and religious authorities. That differentiation is a relatively recent move perhaps it's in ancient Egypt, it wasn't differentiated. In ancient Persia, it wasn't differentiated. And this is the point he's making, that these people were called divinity, and that gives us hints about what do we mean by divine. And Alexander the Great was a son of God, even though we know that he was the son of Philip of Macedonia. Well, what do you mean he's the son of God? And if you look at some of my Sunday school classes when I'm talking about that, why did they think that Alexander the Great was the son of the gods? Well, because of what he was able to do. And so Christianity comes from. Well, where does Christianity get that from? Well, actually it gets it from Judaism, which, separates God. God is holy, 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 but the whole earth is full of his glory. And so when Jesus comes along, obviously a crisis develops within Judaism surrounding Jesus. And when the Apostle Paul goes throughout the Eastern Roman Empire and starts going to synagogues and saying, Jesus is the Lord, well, now suddenly they have a crisis to work out. And that crisis often resulted in violence and bloodshed because it was that important. Well, why was it that important? Because, as Peterson said, their entire matrix was integrated into these questions. All right? Now remember, Peterson starts his journey with this book because he saw that the entire matrix of the world was integrated into the questions of the conflict between the Soviet Union and the Western Bloc, the United States, the Eastern Bloc, and the Western Bloc.
But the Christian response to that was never confuse the specific sovereign with the principle of sovereignty itself.
And in many ways, what Martin Luther, who we'll talk about later, that's exactly what he was working on and working through. And via the Protestant Reformation, they were working on that. Via the split between the Eastern Orthodox churches and the Eastern Greek churches and the Western Latin church, that's exactly the split. How should you regard the Pope?
It's brilliant. You see how difficult it is to come up with an idea like that, so that even the person who has the power is actually subordinate to something else. Subordinate to, let's call it a divine principle, for lack of a better word.
And actually it is brilliant, because what it affords you to be able to do with a system like that is to actually constantly improve your recalibrations of that which is good. Because if you say that, well, the top of the pinnacle was arrived at by Abraham Lincoln, well, now suddenly no president can be higher. But look at what is done with Jesus. He sits on the right hand of the Father, but he's out of our debates. And in a sense, part of what happens with the American experiment of secular democracy and the separation, the Establishment Clause in the Constitution that keeps the church separate, it allows the conversation about nobility, about what's at the top of the hierarchy, to be able to continue down here below. Is it Obama? Is it Trump? What's at the top of the hierarchy? Was it Bill Clinton? Was it Ronald Reagan? Was it JFK? Was it FDR? Was it Teddy Roosevelt? Was it Abraham Lincoln? Was it George Washington? The conversation can continue by separating these things out.
So that even the king himself is subordinate to the principle. And we still believe that, because we believe that our president, our prime minister, is subordinate to the damn law.
And if you look at all of the conversation about Trump, these are the conversations. Similar conversations under Obama.
Whatever the body of law, right? There's a principle inside that even the leader is subordinate to.
Now you can ask, and you can say that this is an abstraction, but part of the problem within our language game is that when you say it's abstraction, you make it less real. That's a problem, because in many ways, part of an undercurrent of all of my videos is getting at the definition of what is real. Now, Strawn might Strong, I know you're listening to this, and you're going to have an email for me about this. I know you are. That which is most real is that which governs. And so, actually, when we call it an abstraction, we need a better word. Well, we actually have a better word. We call it God. And God is more real. Why? Because God governs. And the law is an articulation. It's a specific tool, a specific representation that tries to be revelation of God. Okay? So that's how this is working.
And without that, you could argue you can't even have a civilized society, because your leader immediately turns into something that's transcendent and all-powerful. And I mean, that's certainly what happened in the Soviet Union and what happened in Maoist China and what happened in Nazi Germany, because there was nothing for the powerful to subordinate themselves to.
So in other words, these societies couldn't do the kind of conversation and struggle in order to continue to recalibrate and improve that which is at the top of the hierarchy, that which is most real.
You're supposed to be subordinate to God. So what does that mean? Well, we're going to tear that idea apart, but partly what it means is that you're subordinate, even if you're sovereign, to the principle of sovereignty itself.
And again, when we use the word principle, we devalue it in our materialist assumption context, because it's merely a principle. Now, we get a little Platonic sometimes with our principles, but in our world, that which is matter is most real. And what he's arguing for is an inversion of that by saying that this stuff on top that he's trying to describe is more real than the matter. And in fact, all of this life can only happen if this real thing reveals itself embodied. Again, think of Aristotelian formal cause. This most real thing takes shape in our lives. Now, if you look at classical Christian assertion, think about the words of a spiritual. Lord, I want to be like Jesus in my life. Why? Because it's most real, and I imagine that if I embody that most real thing, then what? And that's where Peterson, when asked about the resurrection, says, we have no idea the limitations of when that is embodied, what can happen. And so I see there Peterson has these moments where he's right there.
And then the question is, what the hell is the principle of sovereignty? And I could say we have been working that out for a very long period of time. And so that's one of the things that we'll talk about, because the ancient Mesopotamians and the ancient Egyptians had some very interesting, dramatic ideas about that.
All right. I was able to remember where I was going to stop because I timed it between the water. And so here's a question. Is Uncle Sam real? What makes up the United States government? Uncle Sam, he's a guy with, wearing stars and stripes. He's got a top hat. He says, I want you. Is Uncle Sam real? Is the United States government real? Show me where the United States government is. And you'll very quickly realize that the United States government is not a material thing. Where does the United States government reside? In Washington, D.C.? Sort of, but it could move. The United States government is embodied in some ways in the president, but we would say, now we've got sort of a trinity in the United States government. We've got the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And in many ways, when that trinity gets out of whack, we have real problems. Boy. But the United States government is in some ways more real than the White House or the Capitol or the building of the Supreme Court or the paper that has writing on it that has the Constitution. And you can begin to see, well, how is it more real? And exactly what is more real in the world? Because life is supposed to conform via the laws and the institutions. And again, many of these institutions are in fact themselves not material. They take material form. Is Uncle Sam real? You act like Uncle Sam is real. Why? You pay taxes. You obey the law. You have feelings about being a patriotic American, or maybe you have feelings about how America could be better. But here's an example of, well, is it an abstraction? Is there a principality? Is there a hierarchy? And so when, for example, President Trump meets Chairman Kim in North Korea, and I had a little tweet about the two-armed handshake, and well, how does that work in Korean culture because Koreans have a very hierarchical culture, and watch Korean dramas and Americans watching Korean dramas will be surprised by very quickly you begin to see these patterns of social etiquette, and so then I know some Koreans, and so I'll ask them sometime, and they'll laugh, and then they'll explain to me the rules of their etiquette. But they also understand that, we Americans don't work by the same rules, many of them because they're living here in the United States, on and on and on. But there's all this stuff going on, and this stuff governs. Now, I've played this video a lot, and I'm going to keep playing it because I think it's one of the most important videos in this whole conversation.
So, in what sense do you mean? What is the God that you act as though he, she, it exists?
See, now, if you listen very carefully to the first biblical lecture, Sam, you wouldn't have to ask that question, because we've just articulated how you act out God. Just like when you pay your taxes, you act out the reality of Uncle Sam, and you submit to Uncle Sam. And when you drive the speed limit, and when you want to do something but you don't do it because it will violate the law, you're acting out the existence of Uncle Sam, even though, is Uncle Sam a man in the sky? Can you find Uncle Sam by going up in an airplane or a spaceship? But Uncle Sam is very, very real. You believe in Uncle Sam every time you pay your taxes.
And what is the God-shaped thing I must have in my life to prevent me from being a, quote, real atheist?
Well, okay, first of all, I have to point out that there's no possible way I can answer both those questions in 2 minminutes.
Well, it's the same question. What do you mean by God?
Okay, well, I'm going to tell you some of the things that I mean by God. Okay?
We do have to get the question. Well, that was a pretty resounding no. Let's do this, but let's be deliberate about time.
Okay. Well, I'm going to read some things that I wrote because it's so complicated that I'm not sure that I can just spin it off the top of my head, and so you'll have to excuse me. And what I'm going to do is sort of paint a picture by highlighting different things. So now I already made one point here. I made the point that part of the conception of God that underlies the Western ethos is the notion that whatever God is expressed in the truthful speech that rectifies pathological hierarchies. And that isn't all it does. It also confronts the chaos of being itself and generates habitable order. That's the metaphysical proposition. And that's best conceptualized as at least one element of God. And so I would think about it as a transcendent reality that's only observable across the longest of time frames, the longest of iterated time frames, to your point. So here's some propositions, and they're complicated, and they need to be unpacked. So I'm just going to read them, and that'll have to do for the time being. So God is how we imaginatively and collectively represent the existence and action of consciousness across time.
Okay, consciousness. Go all the way back to the first clip that I had with Bishop Barron. Consciousness. These are these tiny little, many of his talks, these tiny little 3, 4, 5 minutes where he has this little talk about consciousness before he goes on to the thing that everybody else is paying attention to. God is God. This structure is God the Father, he says to Bishop Barron. And Bishop Barron doesn't say, ho, wait. What did you just say? Through the miracle of audio recordings, we can slow him down and hear him say, the structure is God the Father. Well, it's consciousness. Well, God the Father is this conscious structure that is out there in the midst of chaos and uses logos to create habitable order. Habitable order for God the Father? No, God the Father doesn't need habitable order. God the Father is. He makes habitable order for human beings. So, and then we are in his image, so we have this consciousness too, and in a very tiny scale, we create this habitable order.
As the most actively represent the existence and action of consciousness across time. As the most real aspects of existence manifest themselves across the longest of time frames, but are not...
The most real aspect of existence, just like the United States government is very, very real, but you can't grab onto it at all.
Not necessarily apprehensible as objects in the here and now.
It's not apprehensible as objects in the here and now. You can't apprehend the United States government because it's not a thing you can lay your hands on.
So what that means in some sense is that you have conceptions of reality built into your biological and metaphysical structure that are a consequence of processes of evolution that occurred over unbelievably vast expanses of time, and that structure your perception of reality in ways that it wouldn't be structured if you only lived for the amount of time that you're going to live. And that's also part of the problem of deriving values from facts, because you're evanescent and you can't derive the right values from the facts that portray themselves to you in your lifespan.
In other words, you, little human being who lives maybe 8 or 100 years, you can't derive those values from facts because you don't live anywhere near long. So what exactly is doing it? You're not doing it. What exactly is doing it? Us. What the heck is us? Us is about as material as the United States government. What common things are we holding together? Well, it's not a wiki page that we're all writing on. It's all the wiki pages. It's all the art. It's all the songs. It's all the music. It's all the conversations. It's all the, we used to just have obelisks. Now we have YouTube. It's all of this stuff that we're doing, and we're all working on this stuff.
Which is why you have a biological structure that's like 3.5 billion years old. So God is that which eternally dies and is reborn in the pursuit of higher being and truth. That's a fundamental element of hero mythology. God is the highest value in the hierarchy of values. That's another way of looking at it. God is what calls and what responds in the eternal call to adventure. God is the voice of conscience. God is the source of judgment and mercy and guilt.
This is a very real God we're listening to here. And this is all, as I've said before many times, this is God number one. God the Father is a structure. Remember?
God is the future to which we make sacrifices.
That's a big one. And if you listen to the Easter message he gave in Easter 2018, that's a biggie.
And something akin to the transcendental repository of reputation. Here's a cool one if you're an evolutionary biologist. God is that.
See, I don't think these other two guys, well, I know Sam Harris doesn't. I think Brett has a clearer idea, but I don't think Sam Harris has any idea what Jordan is talking about, and Sam Harris is about to show us.
Which selects among men in the eternal hierarchy of men. So, men arrange themselves into hierarchies, and then men rise in the hierarchy. And there's principles that are important that determine the probability of their rise. And those principles aren't tyrannical power. They're something like the ability to articulate truth and the ability to be competent and the ability to make appropriate moral judgments. And if you can do that in a given situation, then all the other men will vote you up the hierarchy, so to speak, and that will radically increase your reproductive fitness. And the operation of that process across long expanses of time looks to me like it's codified in something like the notion of God the Father.
That's an astounding thing. That's an astounding thing that we have the capacity to, and we don't even, again, our little conscious mind doesn't even know it's doing it necessarily, but we have the ability to somehow detect nobility. And again, when you get into the, what Lewis talks about in the beginning of The Problem of Pain, and you get into Rudolf Otto and the idea of the holy, that we have a sense of the noumenal, that this is sort of like one of our senses, not just our five senses, and just our reduction down to five senses, I think, is actually part of the problem of the limitation of human being. We have a sense of the noumenal, we have the sense of the noble, and so we live up to this. And this even starts when you're a child, when you look at the nobility of your parent, if your parent is noble, and you start to emulate it. Unfortunately, if you look at the poverty of your parent's character, you might emulate that too. But as you grow, you'll begin to realize and recalibrate it.
Father. It's also the same thing that makes men attractive to women, because women peel off the top of the male hierarchy, and the question is, what should be at the top of the hierarchy? And the answer right now is tyranny as part of the patriarchy, but the real answer is something more like the ability to use truthful speech in the service of, let's say, well-being. And so that's something that operates across tremendous expanses of time, and it plays a role in the selection for survival itself, which makes it a fundamental reality.
Jordan, can I just cut in here with one question?
That's because you don't understand.
I'll stop with that for now.
What?
You weren't listening.
So I was not hearing in that list of attributes a God who could care if
God number 2.
anyone masturbated. I was not hearing a God who...
Depends on what else is stopping you from doing, Sam.
Sorry, I missed that.
Red understands.
I said it depends on what else it's stopping you from doing.
Well, yeah, okay, so it's
yeah,
important to live.
Seriously.
It's important to do something other than masturbate.
Yes. Yes, which actually constitutes a problem for many people.
Which is harder than it sounds.
Yeah.
I'm not hearing a God, a personal God who can possibly hear anyone's prayers, much less answer them, right? And so I'm wondering what percentage of religious people who would say, "Oh yeah, I believe in God and it's the most important thing in my life."
That's actually an important question. What percentage of religious people are able to formulate this in their conscious self? And this is an amazing thing about us. We do these things and we are not conscious of them. We have capacities, and this is what Peterson says in that first thing. We act out things we don't understand. And this is exactly Peterson's point about Sam Harris, is he's acting out the reality of God, and he doesn't understand because it's built in. And what Peterson is trying to do is expand Sam's consciousness and say, Sam, take a look at the world. Look at this. This is, there's God. And if you say, well, if I can't lay hands or point to an old man in the sky, there is no God, is like saying, if you can't go and lay hands on Uncle Sam, the United States government does not exist. It's that simple.
What percentage of those religious people do you think have in mind a God of the sort you just described?
I don't know, Sam. It's a good question, because when I go talk to people, when I talk to people online and use exactly this terminology, millions of people listen.
Now, they might not understand exactly what's going on, which is exactly why it takes me a long time to figure it out, and it takes me slowing all this stuff down and, trying to tease it all out. But another piece of them gets it. And again, that's they're filtering through all of this stuff, and so they hear it and they say, yeah, that's right. Well, why is it right? Well, I can't explain it. And we have this experience all the time.
So it's not so obvious what percentage of people see it this way. It may be that they have the intuitions, but they haven't been articulated well.
Bingo.
I mean, this is the problem. This is what worries me about this. So,
I don't think. Just remember Peterson saying, "Asked to explain it." Now his wife isn't even saying, "Explain yourself, Sam." He's just going to offer something from the writer that really doesn't make much sense.
You could do the same thing with the idea of ghosts, right?
No. Why? Sam, if you're looking for an illustration, look at Uncle Sam. That might be a valid illustration. That might be a valid illustration to cast doubt on God number 2. But what it does is illuminates the reality of God number 1 and how you yourself act out all of this stuff for reasons you don't understand. A ghost does not. A ghost is a terrible illustration of what Jordan is talking about here, because ghosts don't function in the hierarchy like the United States government, Uncle Sam, or God. It's a terrible illustration.
So people traditionally have believed in ghosts. It's an archetype, you might say, the ghost. Survival of death is certainly an archetype. And we know what most people most of the time mean when they say they believe in ghosts.
And by him using this illustration, it's clear he doesn't have any idea what Peterson is talking about. Well, I'll leave that for now because I've showed this quite a bit. The illustration of ghosts, we never imagine ghosts play anything like this real, like God does, like even the United States government does, something that governs behavior and shapes existence. Now, in my sermons, again, I preach my sermons on a different channel. I have my rough draft on this channel. But really, when you get into God number 2, you're starting to talk about the efficacy of proper transactionality in religion and spirituality. Now, that's a big word. And it basically means that if I do something else comes my way in the material world. Now, again, part of my huge project is trying to figure out, how does materiality fit into this entire picture? And lately I've been thinking of how materiality is actually, well, it's exactly what we say. It's a medium. It's a medium of communication. A medium of communication. Oh, I still got one around here from back when I was using the illustration. Where's that medium of communication? I know I got it here on my messy office. Oh, there it is. It's peeking out. This is a medium of communication by the United States government. It's full of symbolism, front and back. This is a medium of communication. This is an expression of the United States government. That's what materiality does. But the thing which is more real than this, now this gets complicated because if the world lasts that long, there'll be a day in which the United States government no longer exists. And in fact, the United States government is a fairly unstable god because it continues to change and develop as it goes through time. But there might come a day when this dollar bill or other ones like it might survive, just like coins in the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire no longer exists. And so you might say, well, what is more real, the coin or the empire? This gets complicated, but this word, that which governs. Now, that little Roman coin isn't governing something to the degree that that Roman coin causes action in this world is a sign of its relative power or reality, let's say. But the United States government is far more real than this medium. Materiality is a medium of expression of that which is most real. Let's use that. So here's the question. When I give this to the United States government, they relieve me of my burden of taxation. All right? So there's a transactionality I express with the United States government. Now, what Sam Harris is really focused on is anybody going to make him go to church like in Puritan America? Is anybody going to impinge on him with respect to masturbation or prayer or going to church or what kind of church or other behavior based on this story? And in a sense, Jordan Peterson is saying God number 1 is already impinging on his behavior. And Sam is unaware of it, but he's acting it out all the time. But it goes deeper than that. So can you actually, and this gets into the question of sacrifice in the future, can you actually negotiate with this God, and what is that like? And people do it all the time. If you look at the nuns and the duns, people believe in karma, and karma is in fact a mechanistic transactionality with a spiritual realm. Watch old versions of My Name is Earl. Do good things, have good things happen. Do bad things, have bad things happen. Once people give up formal religions, they start to develop their own religions. You have the law of attraction. You have all of these ideas. We've got someone who's very big into this running for president right now, which fascinates me. This is very real stuff to us. Skepticism about the plausibility structure of Christianity that many of the nuns and duns have received has arrived by a variety of means. The efficacy of practice towards the stated ends. Religion tends to say, do these things and you'll be blessed. People did these things and they didn't feel particularly blessed. That casts doubt on the plausibility structure of the religion. Tim Keller, in between 2006 and 2008, had scores of sermons on this. It was something that he was working on in that period. You know, gospel versus religion. That's where he was working on this sort of idea. The value of those stated ends is compared to the generational, individual felt goals. Generations are valuing different things at the top of their value hierarchy, and so you've got the things at the top of the previous generation's value hierarchy, and what we've had in the United States are these generational conversations where the next generation is skeptical about the previous generations, and so they're testing their hierarchies, and we're doing this now radically with questions of sexuality and money and all sorts of things. You look at the builder generation and you look at the millennials and look at how different they are in terms of how they're living out their lives and what they're doing in this and what we're doing in this, again, I use this word hesitancy, in this abstracted realm. Having these conversations as we're processing through these value hierarchies and where they should be going. And now part of our value hierarchy is that we want to do this with words and not with bullets. All right? Bullets are an extremely effective medium of communication because they tend to end conversation participants. And they change conversations. The value of the religion's moral assertions. They are tested generationally. And so, you know, part of what I was doing in these sermons recently, and I'm continuing to do, is the Jews come back from the Babylonian exile, and the prophets are saying these things to them, and so the Jews are building the temple and trying to act in this certain way, and they're not receiving everything that the exiles, that the prophets told the exiles they would receive, and this develops a crisis of faith, and this gets into the fact that the internal story and the external story have to line up and work together. Otherwise, we feel distress. And when we feel distress, well, then we start changing things in our lives to try to make the outside and the inside fit together. Now, again, I'm reading Fatal Discord, and this has gotten in the way of my YouTube watching because I'm really enjoying this book, and I'm seeing how it ties into all sorts of things. Sam Harris would say faith versus reason, but actually, these things have been going on for a very long time, and you can watch the transactions of them. There's a lot of movement going on with respect to many of these issues in the time of the Reformation and the period after the Reformation, which is the Enlightenment. Luther and Erasmus they're expressing significant movement away from moving spiritual gears with material pieces towards a certain internalization of faith and religious experience. Now, this comes through often with respect to things like the Eucharist or the Mass or the Lord's Supper. First up was the Mass or the Lord's Supper. This was the sacrament that had given Luther the most trouble during his earlier years as a priest. Luther is wrestling with his insides and his outsides and the law and all of these things going on. This all comes together in the heart of this brilliant, explosive, emotional Augustinian monk who changes the world. And again, this is a great book to read. Read it if you want to learn something about the Reformation and this whole period, because there's a lot of stuff going on in it. It's written by not a theologian, but a journalist, and he tells the story very well. The intricate system of regulations, obligations, and admonitions prescribed by Gabriel Biel and other late scholastics had brought on fits of terror. This is his insides and his outsides not working together. In his study of Scripture, however, Luther could find no textual basis for any of it. It had all come since 1,500 years. And now he denounced the way this most holy sacrament had been turned into mere merchandise, a market, a profit-making business. He was addressing the corruption in the church, on which priests and monks depended for their livelihood. A reference to masses for the rich, for the dead, and rich endowments provided for them. The main cause of these abuses, Luther maintained, was the specious doctrine that the Lord's Supper was a good work and a sacrifice. Now, right there, a good work and a sacrifice, these are two representations of this representation, okay? Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me. It's not how, what, why, what will this accomplish? A reenactment of Christ's redemptive death at Calvary. Defined in this way, it had become a rite that churchgoers could count on as a meritorious work, along with fasts, vigils, and pilgrimages to shorten his stay in purgatory. Now, purgatory, another representation of the idea that, well, you had a representation of what heaven would be. You had a representation of how we were in earth, and the church quite reasonably said, we're going to have to get from A to B. Maybe purgatory is this process by which all of this leftover stuff that still clings to you can be dealt with before you're actually ready for heaven. All right? Rather than approach the Mass as passive onlookers, Christians should actively participate in it. Now, what did he mean by that? He meant a mental, emotional, I can never think of this Vervaeke word. It's not an adaptation. It's what we've done is we've, in a sense, abstracted. We've mentally internalized. We've used all this brain machinery for visualization, and this is the locale where Luther sees the real work happening in the Lord's Supper. It's a turn from the physical to the psychological, okay? Rather than approach the Mass as passive onlookers, Christians should actively participate in seeing it not as a commemoration of Christ's death, but as a divine promise of forgiveness. Luther wants to see this changed, okay? This is a very big change. Seeing it not as a commemoration of Christ's death, but as a divine promise of forgiveness for sin to those who have faith in Christ. So faith now becomes this thing. Again, this is all getting very psychological. Luther favored retaining the Lord's Supper as a sacrament. He's going to get down to two, because you can only really find two in Scripture, partially because Ephesians 5, Erasmus, has corrected the Vulgate. The Vulgate said a sacramentum, when the Greek said a mysterion. So marriage is a mystery in the Greek. Jerome said it's a sacrament. And so the Roman Catholic Church quite a bit later said marriage is a sacrament. Luther comes along with Erasmus and says, no, it's a mystery, because that's what the text says. Well, why do we prioritize a text over a church? And why, in the course of American law, do we prioritize a written law over a man? Things are connecting with all of this stuff. This is why I'm so interested in the book. But only if it's performed with the same simplicity and lack of ceremonial pomp. There's a skepticism built into here that the gears of heaven cannot be moved by the priests and popes on earth. Well, what are we supposed to understand by the keys of the kingdom? What did Jesus mean by that? Well, Luther's going to reinterpret that. He's going to reintegrate it into his system. And he's leveraging the text of the New Testament, the text which are written words, over living person speaking, because written words, in a sense, embody something abstractly that spoken words are sort of, after I speak them, out they go and they're gone. But now with YouTube, I'm speaking them and they're recorded, able to be played again and again. All of this stuff is at play. Luther favored retaining the Lord's Supper as a sacrament, but only if it was performed in the same simplicity and lack of ceremonial pomp that marked the celebration of the Last Supper. I think, again, here there's a psychological, there's a transition to the psychological. This emphasis on simplicity in the Mass led Luther to continue the task of chipping away at the authority of the priesthood, no special people, equality, the priesthood of all believers, that he had begun in the Christian nobility. By investing the Mass with such a mystery and miraculous power, this is deeply psychological, he wrote, the Church had greatly enlarged the role of the priests as intermediaries between Christ and God. Now, what's interesting is that we see people from plain church traditions looking at more sacramental traditions, more liturgical traditions that have pomp and circumstance, have pomp and really have pomp and pageantry, let's say. Now people are looking at and saying that's more spiritual when there's pomp and pageantry as opposed to the plain. And you can see, and this is where Barfield is interesting, you can see these transitions happening in, for lack of a better word, the zeitgeist. By investing the Mass with such mystery and miraculous power, he wrote, the Church had greatly enlarged the role of the priest and its intermediaries between the Christian and God. Now, Luther is doing explaining, and he is explaining the rise of the structure. Is this the only reason? Maybe the fall of the Roman Empire had something to do with it. The physical distance separating the priest at the altar from the layman in the pews, the upholding of the cup from worshippers during communion, the whispering of the words of consecration by the priest as if they were too sacred to be heard by the common people. Luther wants to make this an intelligible thing. We're moving from a drama that's being played out into codified language. This is exactly the move that Peterson is talking about in the first biblical story. It's exactly the move that he says happens with Moses in terms of the codification of the law. Luther is saying we've been acting it out. Now let's say it. Don't whisper the secret sacred words. Say it in the vernacular so it can be psychologically grasped by the people. This is a movement in terms of what this all means. The withholding of the cup from the worshippers during communion and the whispering of the words of consecration by the priest as if they were too sacred to be delivered to the common people, all such practices were aimed at sealing the rite off from the unclean laity. There's some postmodern rationalization going on here, perhaps. Feels postmodern. And making it the preserve of the specialized caste. There's a little bit of a hermeneutic of suspicion here. They're only doing this so that the priests can keep getting their money. When the priest raised the sign of communion, he should pronounce in a loud and clear voice the words of consecration, and he should do so in the language of the people so that faith may be effectively awakened. Faith is awakened psychologically, and it moves. So Luther is basically saying that the Roman system hasn't worked in yielding what? And in a sense, Erasmus was sharing in that, but they had different vehicles towards it. Luther is saying, it isn't working. We need a new movement. And in many ways, Luther was right. But now we have, in a sense, a reverse movement. People coming from plain church traditions going to liturgical traditions saying, I feel it better with the pomp and ceremony. Fascinating. Zwilling is another preacher in Wittenberg. Luther's held up in the Wartburg Castle, and Melanchthon is there fending for himself. Very capable man, Melanchthon. Along Zwingli's most devoted followers was Melanchthon. The highly impressionable scholar would not miss one of his sermons, and under Zwilling's influence, it was he, rather than Karlstadt, and you'll learn about all these characters if you read the book, who decided to press ahead. Even that word, ahead, how is this ahead? Is it ahead? Is it behind? Is it progress? Is it corruption? These are all value judgments. How are we making these value judgments? Based on our hierarchy of values. During these months, Melanchthon met regularly with a group of students in his home. At Michaelmas, September 29, 1521, he went with them into the town church. They're entering the sacred space. Oh, this might be a telemarketer, but I got to check it out because I'm waiting for the HVAC guy. Hang on. He takes these students to the town church. During the service, a layman rather than a priest officiated. This is acting out the idea of the priesthood of all believers before Luther articulates it, perhaps. I'm not sure, but I think so. And the host, rather than being held aloft and then placed on the tongue of each communicant, as was customary, was handed to each in turn, who then put the wafer on his or her tongue, an act long considered a deadly sin. In addition, the wine was offered to all present, and the words of consecration, rather than being read quietly by a priest and inaudibly to the congregation, were proclaimed for all to hear. However modest this impromptu service represented a pivotal movement in the history of the Western Church. A Mass had been held without a priest. The words of consecration had been pronounced inaudibly, and communion had been offered in both kinds. Now, again, someone would say, that wasn't communion. It wasn't done properly. But this motion that Peterson is talking about, from acting out to value hierarchies, they're acting out a value hierarchy and in fact establishing one too. By thus worshiping, those in attendance were announcing a break not only with centuries of sacred tradition, but also with Rome's authority to define the liturgy. Now, what you think happens there, what you think happened there or didn't happen there, says a lot about the world that you inhabit. Your mental frameworks. My last monologue video, let's call it, was Owen Barfield's meaning crisis. Now you have the internal and the inner and the outer meaning of words, and we went into wind. The outer meaning of wind is an atmospheric measured movement of air molecules. The inner meaning is spirit, and of course Barfield says you go all the way back to the time when it was just one word, it was just one idea. They had a different conception. Their consciousness was different. The world they inhabited was different. They used language in a different way. And to a certain degree, we can rediscover and at least taste some of their consciousness by beginning to penetrate the fossils that are these words, by seeing how they used them. In a sense, we go back in time and revivify a bit of that world. Now, Barfield sees a progression, sees evolution in this. Now, is it going anywhere? Well, that depends on the bigger part of your world. But there's been a divorce between the inner and the outer meaning, and it's been all split up. And talked about Brett Weinstein, the assassin robot, imagining it can improve its programming without asking who's doing the tinkering with the code. The assassin robot that says, I'm going to update my programming, is unconscious of the divorce because he doesn't realize that, well, isn't the programming doing the tinkering with the programming? This all gets very confusing very quickly. Now, what happens after the Reformation, after all of these bloody wars, as if you look at Philip Carey's Religion and Philosophy and Religion in the West, is that there's a turning from the text. The texts are not... The Renaissance humanism was all about these texts, and so Erasmus finds all of the... When Erasmus compares even the few Greek manuscripts he can get his hands on with Jerome's Vulgate, even though Erasmus is a huge fan of Jerome, in a sense, Jerome and Erasmus will line up against Augustine and Luther. He reads the Latin text and says, this was sloppily done. Now, Erasmus did his own sloppy work. But that movement to prefer the Greek to the Latin says something about their assumptions about the world. And they're trying to dig deeper, looking for certainty, because they can probably already begin to feel the world changing with the rise of mercantilism, and now more and more people knowing how to read and having their own ideas. And you'll notice that the Protestant Reformation takes place in areas of Europe where there's more chaos, and the book will lay out and show how it's because of the strange, complex patchwork that was the Holy Roman Empire that the Protestant Reformation actually was able to get going. But now after the Reformation causes all of this chaos, that the texts were supposed to yield certainty and uniformity, and there's a big thing there. We feel certainty when we feel uniformity of ideas, which is why we're always looking a little bit earlier in the Bishop Barron, Jordan Peterson comment. They'll talk about the one and the many, actually, a little bit later. We always feel certainty when we feel the one. We feel skepticism when we feel the many. That's why pluralism always makes us feel skeptical. Uniformity makes us feel certain, because all say we now. Battlestar Galactica. Is that what they said? Something like that. You'll correct it in the comments. I know you will. But that's how we feel. When we're all together, we feel certain. When there's many ideas, we feel uncertain. That uncertainty causes dissonance. That causes us to go out and look. And so it's probably a good thing we have a dynamic between the two. But skepticism flourished post-Luther, and the West sought a new foundation for certainty. They went from the text of Aristotle to the empiricism of Newton. Through the continued mastery of nature, which increasingly, again, you've got Barfield's divorce of wind here between wind and spirit. Nature, stuff, becomes impersonal. All right? And it's this impersonality. It's the thing that we can manipulate. Why is it, as Barfield says, the better grasp we have on stuff, the more uncertain we are of meaning in the universe. There's a direct correlation. And so the meaning crisis is really beginning in earnest as we're seeking certainty, and as the matter is unconscious and manipulable. Now I can move this. I am the master of the dollar bill, even if the internal meaning of the dollar, the spirit meaning of the dollar, is being master of me. Through continued mastery of nature, which is assumed to be mindless cause and effect, we harvest some well-being, low-hanging fruit. We make progress against disease. We make progress against whether we make progress on war, that is yet to be seen. The First World War or the Third World War. But our values are governed by the story, and they guide our increasingly powerful hands. And as Barfield says, the more we have our hands on stuff, the less meaning we feel. And this causes discomfort. And so on and on and on we're going with these things, and we're feeling less meaning, and we're feeling more skeptical, and so we're turning over the zeitgeist faster and faster. So what's going on? Well, people get profoundly disturbed if the story inside and the story outside get out of sync. So look at my conversation with, I can't remember her name. The woman with the quality existence channel, because she's a therapist, and we talked about how her working with religious communities, doing clinical work as a mental health worker, began to make her appreciate basically what Jung discovered, and what Peterson was saying is that people can't really be healed unless you get down to the level of their metaphysics of their story. And you looked at how Sevilla, that's her name. It's always a little slow. You looked at how immigration, if you read Slate Star Codec, You look at how immigration increases the rise of mental illness in terms of those who immigrate. Schizophrenia comes up. Bipolar comes up. Why is that? Why would moving location increase mental illness? Probably dozens of reasons for it. And then why does being located within your religious community increase well-being? If you look at Melody at the Skepticon thing that I've used at a variety of videos, I mean, she just admits it. Survey after survey show that the happiest people are religious. The most stable people are religious. All of these values that religion gives, of course it gave values. It was adaptation advantage throughout history. All of this stuff, the storyverse means something. It's in fact critical. When they get out of sync, they get self-destructive. And this leads us back to Jordan Peterson wanting to talk about the Bible with crowds.
Well, thank you all very much for coming. It's really shocking to me that you don't have anything better to do on a Tuesday night. No, seriously though, it is. I mean, you know, it's very strange in some sense that there's so many of you here to listen to a sequence of lectures on the psychological significance of the biblical stories. It isn't something I've wanted to do for a long time, but it still does surprise me that there's a ready audience for it.
And the audience doesn't know why they're there.
Well, so that's good. So we'll see how it goes. And I'll start with this, because this is the right question. The right question is, why bother doing this? And I don't mean, why should I bother doing it? I have my own reasons for doing it, but you might think, well, why bother with this strange old book at all? And that's a good question, you know. It's a contradictory document that's been cobbled together over thousands of years. It's outlasted kingdoms, many, many kingdoms. You know, it's really interesting.
It's more real than kingdoms.
And it turns out that a book is more durable than stone. It's more durable than a castle. It's more durable than an empire. And that's...
If I always talk about this realm as the age of decay. Plato figured out ideas don't decay. Are ideas dependent on the people that hold them? To some degree. But they seem to be colonizing and mastering, being more real than the people that hold them.
It's really interesting, you know, that something in some sense so evanescent can be so long-living. So there's that. That's kind of a mystery. I'm approaching this whole scenario, the biblical stories, as if they're a mystery, fundamentally, because they are. There's a lot we don't understand about them. We don't understand how they came about. We don't really understand how they were put together. We don't understand why they had such an unbelievable impact on civilization. We don't understand how people could have believed them. We don't understand what it means that we don't believe them now, or even what it would mean if we did believe them. And then, on top of all that, there's the additional problem, which isn't specific to me, but is certainly relevant to me, that no matter how educated you are, you're not educated enough to discuss the psychological significance of the biblical stories. But I'm going to do my best, and partly because I want to learn more about them. And one of the
He's typing.
things I've learned is that the best way to learn about something is to talk about it. And when I'm lecturing, I'm thinking, you know, I'm not trying to tell you what I know for sure to be the case, because there's lots of things I don't know for sure to be the case. I'm trying to make sense out of this, and I have been doing this for a long time. Now, you know, you may know, you may not, that I'm an admirer of Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a devastating critic of, I would say, dogmatic Christianity as it was instantiated in institutions, I suppose, although he's a very paradoxical thinker, because, for example, one of the things Nietzsche said was that he didn't believe that the scientific revolution would have ever got off the ground if it hadn't been for Christianity, and more specifically for Catholicism, because he believed that over the course of really 1,000 years, the European mind, so to speak, had to train itself to interpret everything that was known within a single coherent framework.
Remember when I said you look through your framework in order to interpret everything else, and so you say, that's what Catholicism did. It was this rigorous discipline that forced Europe into this.
Coherent if you accept the initial axioms. A single coherent framework. And so Nietzsche believed that Catholicization of the phenomena of life and of history produced the kind of mind that was then capable of transcending its dogmatic foundations and then concentrating on something else, which in this particular case happened to be the natural world. And so Nietzsche believed that in some sense Christianity died at its own hand. It had spent a very long period of time trying to attune people to the necessity of the truth, absent the corruption and all of that that's always part of any human endeavor. And then the truth, the spirit of the truth that was developed by Christianity turned on the roots of Christianity, and everyone woke up and said something like, or thought something like, well, how is it that we came to believe any of this? It's like waking up one day and noting that you really don't know why you put a Christmas tree up, but you've been doing it for a long time, and that's what people do. And there are reasons that Christmas trees came about, but the ritual lasts long after the reasons have been forgotten. So now Nietzsche, although he was a critic of Christianity and also a champion of its disciplinary capacity, because you see, the other thing that Nietzsche believed was that it was not possible to be free in some sense unless you had been a slave. And by that he meant that you don't go from childhood to full-fledged adult individuality. You go from childhood to a state of discipline, which you might think is akin to slavery, to self-imposed slavery. That would be the best scenario, where you have to discipline yourself to become something specific before you might be able to reattain the generality that you had as a child.
Now one could argue that what discipline really is the capacity to create and maintain a behavioral hierarchy, where there's a value at the top that gets expressed down below. That's what discipline is.
And he believed that Christianity had played that role for Western civilization. But in the late 1800s, he announced that God was dead. And you often hear of that as something trite.
And I would argue that in the late 1800s, the God that was dead is God number one and God number two, they imagined. But there's so much sunk cost into God that with the skepticism about God number one, God number two rushed to fill the vacuum. Read Chuck Colson's Born Again.
Triumphant. But for Nietzsche, it wasn't, because he was too nuanced a thinker to be that simple-minded. See, Nietzsche understood that, and this is something I'm going to try to make clear, is that there's a very large amount that we don't know about the structure of experience, that we don't know about reality, and we have our articulated representations of the world, and then you could think of outside of that, there are things we know absolutely nothing about, and there's a buffer between them, and those are things we sort of know something about, and we don't know them in an articulated way. Here's an example. Sometimes you're arguing with someone close to you, and they're in a bad mood, and they're being touchy and unreasonable, and you keep the conversation up, and maybe all of a sudden they get angry, or maybe they cry, and then when they cry, they figure out what they're angry about, and it has nothing to do with you, even though you might have been what precipitated the argument, and that's an interesting phenomenon as far as I'm concerned, because it means that people can know things at one level without being able to speak what they know at another. And
that's the consciousness Congress. That's the fact that our consciousness is right here in the middle. Our brain is so much bigger and filtering all this kind of stuff, but the communication between them is very difficult, and that's why people pay attention to their dreams, and that's why people see psychologists and talk and talk and talk, and then a light comes on and People see a pastor and they talk and talk and talk, and a light comes on.
So in some sense, the thoughts rise up from the body, and they do that in moods, and they do that in images, and they do that in actions. And we have all sorts of ways that we understand before we understand in a fully articulated manner. And so we have this articulated space that we can all discuss, and then outside of that, we have something that's more akin to a dream that we're embedded in, and it's an emotional dream.
Now, akin to a dream, that's akin is a really big word in that. We don't really know what that's like because what we see is the dream. That's this liminal space that in a sense we have access to. What it's akin to, that the dream probably is a representation of that which is out there, which is just as mysterious as the world of electrons and molecules that make up my cell phone holder. It's just as mysterious to us as that.
Dream that we're embedded in, and that's based at least in part on our actions. I'll describe that later. And then outside of that is what we don't know anything about at all. And in that dream, that's where the mystics live, and that's where the artists live, and they're the mediators.
And it's been fascinating to me how many people, and you can see this in the people who have come on my channel and talked to me, how many of them are artists. That blew me away, and it continues to. Someone will contact me. I'm an artist. I'm an illustrator. I'm a, again and again and again. It's like, what's with that? Well, this is the space we're inhabiting.
Between the absolute unknown and the things we know for sure. And you see, what that means in some sense is what we know is established on a form of knowledge that we don't really understand. And that if those two things are out of sync, so you might say if our articulated knowledge is out of sync with our dream, then we become dissociated internally. We think things we don't act out, and we act out things we don't dream, and that produces a kind of sickness of the spirit.
And not just act out things that we or don't dream. This is also true in terms of the mythologies that we inhabit and the value structures that we inhabit. And so people will come to me as a pastor and they'll be disturbed by these actions they can't get rid of because they know they're not supposed to do them. So, pastor, how can I stop doing these things? And we might talk strategy, but often we will. So if you get into psychotherapy, well, what do you spend your time doing in psychotherapy? Talking. Why? Hoping you'll stumble upon this.
And that sickness of the spirit, its cure is something like an integrated system of belief and representation. And then people turn to things like ideologies, which
they'll turn to ideologies, but if their religion is functioning properly, it will help them be a whole. In other words, you need to inhabit this world. Your story verse and your inner verse have to work together. And if they don't, you're going to change your religion. You're going to change your spouse. You're going to change your political party. You're going to try changing all sorts of things in a frantic attempt to get it all to work.
I regard as parasites on an underlying religious substructure to try to organize their thinking, and then that's a catastrophe. And that's what Nietzsche foresaw. You see, he knew that when we knocked the slats out of the base of Western civilization by destroying this representation, this God ideal, let's say, that we would destabilize and move back and forth violently between nihilism, let's say, and the extremes of ideology. He was particularly concerned about radical left ideology, and believed and predicted this in the late 1800s, which is really an absolute intellectual tour de force of staggering magnitude. Predicted that in the 20th century that hundreds of millions of people would die because of the replacement of these underlying dreamlike structures with this rational but deeply incorrect representation of the world. And, we've been oscillating back and forth between left and right in some sense ever since, and, with some good sprinkling of nihilism in there and despair. And in some sense, that's the situation of the modern Western person, and increasingly of people in general. I think part of the reason that Islam has its backup with regards to the West to such a degree, there's many reasons and not all of them are valid, that's for sure, but one of the reasons is that, they being still grounded in a dream, let's say, they can see that the rootless, questioning mind of the West poses a tremendous danger to the integrity of their culture. Now, and it does. I mean, Westerners, us, we undermine ourselves all the time with our searching intellect, and I'm not complaining about that,
Searching intellect. When I play the next clip from the Bishop Barron, look for that phrase.
There isn't anything easy that can be done about it, but it's still a sort of fruitful catastrophe. And, it has real effects on people's lives. It's not some abstract thing, lots of times when I've been treating people for depression, for example, or anxiety, they have existential issues, It's not just some psychiatric condition. It's not just that they're tapped off of normal because their brain chemistry is faulty, although, sometimes that happens to be the case. It's that they are overwhelmed by the suffering and complexity of their life, and they're not sure why it's reasonable to continue with it,
Now, if you look at my first talk in Melbourne, where I don't have the second and third one yet. I'm still waiting for them from Australia. But if you look at my first talk, I make the point that people listening to the biblical series, listening to a video of Jordan Peterson talking about stuff they don't fully understand, find relief from depression. It's a crazy thought that you can watch a YouTube video and find relief from depression. And in fact, you chose the video yourself for reasons you don't understand. Well, why? Well, for exactly this dynamic that Peterson's talking about. Peterson is helping your outside world and your inside world get right. And the reason, the symptom of the outside world and the inside world not being put together was partly a symptom of that was depression. And getting that right, even by watching Jordan Peterson, helped make you feel better. And I have a list of people that I can use as examples, and they're on videotape. They're on my YouTube channel that you can go and find them and listen to it. And I'm sure Peterson's list is 1,000 times larger than mine because his channel is 1,000 times larger than mine. But that's what's happening. That's why Jordan Peterson can help relieve depression in people just by watching his video. It's amazing, and it's true.
They can feel the terrible negative meanings of life, but are skeptical beyond belief about any of the positive meanings. I had one client who was a very brilliant artist, and as long as he didn't think, he was fine, because he'd go and create, and he was really good at being an artist. He just, he had that personality that was continually creative and quite brilliant, although he was self-denigrating. But as soon as he started to think about what he was doing, then, it's like a drill or a saw or something like that. He'd saw the branch off that he was sitting on because he'd start to criticize what he was doing, even the utility of it, even though it was sort of self-evidently useful. And then it would be very, very hard for him to even motivate himself to create. And he always struck me as a good example of the consequences of having your rational intellect divorced in some way from your being, divorced enough so that it actually questions the utility of your being. And it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing. And it's really not a good thing because it manifests itself not only in individual psychopathology, but also in social psychopathology. And that's this proclivity of people to get tangled up in ideologies.
Well, not just ideologies, but it ruptures their families. And they got to get their inside and their outside straight. So they don't know what to do, but they need a new spouse. Boom! Kids are dragged through to the divorce. Or they're going to try drugs. Or they're going to, people will move heaven and earth to try to get their inside story and their outside story together. And if they don't get any help, it can be a lot of mess. And when whole societies don't do this well, as Peterson says, the bodies stack up.
Which I really do think of as they're like crippled religions. That's the right way to think about them. They're like a religion that's missing an arm and a leg but can still hobble along, and it provides a certain amount of security and group identity, but it's warped and twisted and demented and bent, and it's a parasite on something underlying that's rich and true, and that's how it looks to me anyways. And so I think it's very important that we sort out this problem. I think that there isn't anything more important that needs to be done than that. I've thought that for a long, long time, probably since the early 80s, when I started looking at the role that belief systems played in regulating psychological and social health.
And again, I'll go back to my conversation with Sevilla. That's what she saw. That's what religious people see. That's what you see with people. We thought after, once we started getting to the material realm as well, this is going to give us what we need, but we didn't realize that the more mastery we had over this, the more meaningless we felt. And the more mastery we had over the paper, the more the idea had mastery over us. Do some fun things with the videos.
Because you can tell that they do that because of how upset people get if you challenge their belief systems. It's like, why the hell do they care exactly? What difference does it make if all of your ideological axioms are 100% correct? Like, people get unbelievably upset when you poke them in the axioms, so to speak. And it is not by any stretch of the imagination obvious why, but it's like there's a fundamental truth that they're standing on. It's like they're on a raft in the middle of the ocean and you're starting to pull out the logs, and they're afraid they're going to fall in and drown. It's like, drown in what? And what are the logs protecting them from? And why are they so afraid to move beyond the confines of the ideological system? And these are not obvious things. So I've been trying to puzzle that out for a very long time, and I've done some lectures about that are on YouTube. Most of you know that. And some of what I'm going to talk about in this series, you'll have heard if you've listened to the YouTube videos. But, I'm trying to hit it from different angles. And so Nietzsche's idea was that human beings were going to have to create their own values, essentially. Now, he understood that we had bodies and that we had motivations and emotions. Like, he was a romantic thinker in some sense, but way ahead of his time, because he knew that our capacity to think wasn't some free-floating soul, but was embedded in our physiology, constrained by our emotions, shaped by our motivations, shaped by our body. He understood that, but he still believed that the only possible way out of the problem would be for human beings themselves to become something akin to God and to create their own values. And he thought that he talked about the person who could create their own values as the overman or the superman, and that was one of the parts of Nietzschean philosophy that the Nazis, I would say, took out of context and used to fuel their, superior man ideology. So, and we know what happened with that. That didn't seem to turn out very well, that's for sure.
Now, Nietzsche, it was a failure. Why can't we create our own stories? Well, for the same reason the assassin robot can't reprogram himself. And these stories, if you look at Peterson, over vast amounts of time, this is all happening. One little human life. There's no individual that can do this. This is always a massive communal enterprise, and this is why, in a sense, the Darwinian crowdsourced pursuit of the truest story. This is in a sense what Peterson would say we're doing. Now, religion then has sort of become a lost adaptation. If you listen to Adam Friended and one of our conversations, Germany lost the war because Germany had to lose the war because it grabbed onto a false story. And so many of the people that I talked to, Sevilla was saying things like this too. But many of the people that I talked to, Job talks like this. You might see the wisdom from the outside, but you can't get inside. And so you watch Nathan Jacobs with his becoming truly human and reaching the nuns, and many of the nuns they're not only have given up on religion, they've done it kicking and screaming in a sense. They wish they still inhabited the Jesus story, and they wish church offered them the kind of comfort and fulfillment that it's offered their parents and their grandparents. This stuff is beyond us. We're not masters of it. We don't just wake up one day and decide, I'm going to do this. Belief doesn't work that way. And so Adam, for example, speaks with a lot of charity about religion, even though he maintains his own atheism and his own trolling of celebrity or professional atheists. But we're caught in sort of this moment in the movie The Matrix when Cypher looks at the stake when he's negotiating his re-entry back into the Matrix with Agent Smith, and says, I look at this piece of steak and I know it's just code, but I want to go back into the Matrix. And of course Cypher wants to go back into the Matrix for all the wrong reasons, and who knows if Agent Smith would have actually made good on the deal, but he didn't get the chance because Cypher gets, spoiler alert, doesn't get back in. But so the likes of Sam Harris look at the worship services and the prayers and the personal relationship with God number 2 and says, I can't buy that. And part of me looks at that and says, well, that's partly because you've embraced a whole bunch of representations that basically Ten Commandments said no. It's an astounding thing, the third commandment, or the beginning of the Ten Commandments, when the God says, you shall not have a representation of me from anything in the creation. You think about that. You think about that for us human beings, where we're so prone, we can't think without representations. And Jesus comes along, and God is like a father. But God is different from my father. And then of course, Jung work out that we got to go from our father to the father. And so all of this is tremendously difficult. And so, so many people are sort of like Cypher, wanting to get back into the Matrix, and they can't. And they're not sure they should. They're not sure they want to. Your beliefs are not subject to your will, which is exactly the flaw in Nietzsche's scheme. You can't sit down and make this. In fact, again, you look at Karen Wong and the artist that she's doing, she will tell you, she in a sense doesn't own her art. The art manifests from this place within her, the same place of Jordan Peterson, when he looks down into the great hole at the edge of his bed, out of which stuff comes. And even Sam Harris can agree that they don't know where it comes from. Well, here we are. We're on this island surrounded by the liminal coral reefs, which are fertile with spiritual things coming up. There's a vast ocean out there that storms come in, and we're terrified and we don't know what to do. And so we desperately long to inhabit a space where there is a God, where there is a Father in heaven. Even skeptics, however, have plausibility structures, and this is part of, I think, the deceit of the secular frame, which says religious people are in a cocoon and secular people are out there in the bold open air. Well, it's not true. They're just in another cocoon. Even skeptics have a belief system with a functioning plausibility structure, which can be deconstructed. And this is, if you read, for example, do I have any Tim Keller books down here? If you look at Tim Keller's more apologetic work, one of the key things I got from Tim Keller early on was in pointing out that they're all plausibility structures, and you don't exit one plausibility structure without entering another. Now, maybe it's not well formed, and maybe it's more chaotic, and maybe you're thrashing about doing all kinds of damage to the people around you. But you've begun believing different things. It's not really between belief and no belief. It's just different beliefs. It's just different programs. And then you have to ask the question, well, how can one program colonize another? Well, this is where prayer gets funny, because what basically you do when you sit on the edge of your bed is you say to Jesus, colonize me. You're giving your life over to a power, and you think, well, I don't want to give my life over to a power. Oh, you thought you had control over it. Silly. And this is where I love where, you imagine that your imaginative cognition is based on your practice and observing the practice of others. And in a sense, now Bishop Barron, in this last clip I'm going to play, he sort of goes back. But what I want you to see is that what Peterson articulated in the first biblical series about acting out and the spoken word and all of that gets practiced. And whereas we can't really go back, we can only go forward, but we'll learn from the back. And so it's usually back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And this gets into some of Peugeot's idea of the circular. But hear how Bishop Barron, where he goes with this.
My position outside the church is actually critical to the success of what I'm doing. People have tried to pin me down multiple times with regards to my belief in God.
Now what is Peterson talking about with that? He's talking about a person who has will, who will judge. That's what he's in fear of. Is it? It's funny because Peterson kind of occupies the opposite space of those who are angry at God and profess their disbelief. Peterson is terrified of God expressing disbelief, but the emotional reaction betrays the belief underneath. So the atheist that is angry with God, saying he disbelieves, Peterson is just exactly the thing, except he's afraid of God, in which he perhaps disbelieves. But his charge against Sam Harris, it's all right there.
I actually did a 2-hour lecture I guess it was a 70-minute lecture in Australia about that question, because I thought about it a lot and about...
Oh, Australia, why Australia? It's, I go out to Australia to talk about this, and some of Peterson's most goddish talks are in Australia. What's going on with Australia?
I've always felt imposed upon, I would say, and boxed in when people ask me that question. But
and this is exactly in our modern realm what we don't want from God. This is exactly what Sam Harris doesn't want. This is exactly what Adam and Eve resisted. We want to be God, and the thought of, and C.S. Lewis gets at this with his idea of our pantheism as sort of our default religion, and because we're in terror of God who is a warrior, a hunter, or a husband who's about to possess us and have us, and we're not sure we want to give in to his love.
I finally figured out that I didn't really feel that I had the moral right to make a claim about belief in God. I mean, it's not a trivial thing to let's say, proclaim.
Yeah.
Because it's not merely a matter of stating in some verbal manner that I am willing to agree semantically with a set of doctrines. It means that you have to live. You have to commit to living a certain way.
Yeah.
And the demand of that life is so stringent and so all-consuming, and you're so unlikely to live up to it, that to make the claim that you believe, I think to me, it smacks of a kind of, I understand why people do it, and this isn't a criticism of people's statement of faith, but for me, the critical element of belief is action. And the requirements of Christianity are so incredibly demanding that I don't see how you can proclaim yourself a believer without being terrified of immediately being struck down by lightning or some such cosmic event.
There's a lot.
You don't believe in God, but you're worried about being struck by lightning. But that then has an interesting psychological thing, because you're not struck by lightning. And I watch people work through these kind of things all the time.
To that, I mean, there's a lot to it. The story that I've always loved about Origen, the great church father, whom Jung loved, by the way. I mean, Jung saw the church fathers as some of the first great psychologists, and Origen's sermons on Genesis, Exodus are like yours in many ways. I mean, I don't know if you've been reading him explicitly, but that sort of psychodynamic and spiritual reading, Origen's all over
He just called Jordan Peterson's biblical series sermons.
that. But the story is about this young guy named Gregory who comes to Origen to learn the doctrine of the Christians. And Origen said to him, first you must come and live our life, and then you'll understand our doctrine. And then,
right there, you live it out, you act it out, and later you can articulate it.
that young kid, Gregory, became St. Gregory Thaumaturgus. He becomes the great saint of the church. But he had to get into the life first. And there's a lot to that. I think the practices of Christianity, they get into your body before they get into your mind. It's also true, I think, that when you take away...
And it's interesting how Luther, tinkering with the practices of Christianity, because corruption had set in, and he's working through that, and so he had to change the practices to have grace and to have a sense of release from the judgment of God get into his mind.
A lot of practices that surround certain doctrines, the doctrine fades from people's minds.
Mm-hmm.
When I was a kid, there was still the practice around the Blessed Sacrament. People, with genuflections, and before you entered the pew in church, you would genuflect. In fact, they say that Catholics of my parents' generation, when they'd come into a movie theater to see a movie in the rows of seats, they would genuflect before they got into the row. But see, that means this thing was so in their bodies, But that practice was communicating to the mind the importance of what's in front of them. Well, the same is true really of all the doctrines. God, in some ways, is a function of this manner of life.
Did you hear that? God is a function of this manner of life. Now nobody's going to tell Jordan Peterson, Bishop Barron, he doesn't believe in God. But what God is Bishop Barron talking about when he says God is a function? This is our view of God. This is how God is real to us psychologically. And again, if you slow down and you re-listen to this stuff, you hear some very interesting things.
And so I've emphasized that actually a lot in my own work. The postmoderns who have influenced Christianity are very strong on that two practices. I mean, my take, Jordan, is that there's 100 ways in to the question of God. There's all kinds of paths, One of them being just that, ritual, the body, the moral life is a way in. To look at the saints and try to be a saint is a great way in. Jared Manley Hopkins, the great Jesuit poet, who was a convert under John Henry Newman, so he himself went through this process of discovering the faith. But someone came to him and said, I'm really wrestling with belief in God. And he said, give alms. Whereas he didn't provide an argument or proof. He said, do something. And of course, if you play the whole thing out, I mean, if God is love, that's what God is, then performing an act of love gets you closer to God than almost anything else. And so the giving of alms can lead you into that sacred space. Now, the questing mind, then wants to ask all kinds of questions about it. And
the questing mind. This is what Peterson's talk about in the first biblical series.
Grounded. So, fides quaerens intellectum of Anselm, right? Faith seeking understanding. That's where theology, philosophy will come in.
Well, and I've been talking to my audiences practically about my position outside.
Stop it.
Is that?
And so then that leads actually into the clip that I first played. So, a lot for us to chew on there, and I hope to have time. I've got so many things I want you to listen to and revisit, but it's interesting how now re-listening to the biblical series, how much more I know about Peterson, how better I understand it, how interesting his position is, especially with respect to unbelief in the zeitgeist in the culture right now, how so many people, or at least a number of people, are they sort of like Cypher want to get back into the matrix, and because they've learned that they can't live, they can't be whole unless their story is whole. That's the kinds of creatures we are. So 2+ hours. Yeah, let me know what you think.